Well, we've only got maybe a couple more days left now before Trump sort of takes in. Graham, of course, has described it this morning on the Morning Brewers, the last week of insanity. And if you've been keeping an eye on some of these confirmation hearings, some of them have been a bit loopy. And quite frankly, I never thought I'd be in a position where I could describe Marco Rubio as being seen as the least controversial pick for Trump's cabinet. Sure, I've got problems with Marco Rubio and some of the stuff that he said in that confirmation hearing, but he is comparatively normal to some of the other picks that he's got going on. And we haven't even got to the JFK Jr. hearing yet. Oh boy, that's going to be fun. That's going to be fun indeed when that happens. But I, of course, and we've talked about this briefly before, the idea of talking about European strategic autonomy. And when I mean European strategic autonomy, I don't just mean the EU, I mean all of Europe. And that this is something we have to care about increasingly more and more. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue across Europe because you look at Estonia, and there is a city literally like right on the border. The line goes down, and there's like this little bump where the city is. I think it's called Nivor, something like that. But it sits right on the border. And remember, Biden has stressed that every inch of NATO territory will be protected. However, a couple of days, Biden's not going to be in charge. Donald Trump's in charge now. What's to stop Putin going, yeah, sorry, Estonia, that's now our city? And not taking all of Estonia, just taking that city, just testing NATO. Because even though Donald Trump has said he wants to, quote, leave NATO, there are things that could stop him, doesn't mean it will stop him. It might maybe slow him down, but that in itself threatens the entire alliance. Donald Trump also doesn't have to respond to Article 5. Oh, they took that city. Well, he could turn around and just say, well, sorry, Estonia. Putin's taking that city from you. Sad day for you. So there is a real case now for more and more to be talking about European strategic and defense stuff as a whole. And we're going to be taking a look at an interview that was carried out by a very sort of influential think tank in Europe called the European Council on Foreign Relations, I believe it is. I can't remember if that's the full name now, but they did an interview with its head called Almut Muller. I hope that's how you say it. But she's the head of this sort of foreign sort of policy think tank. It's very influential. I want to talk about it. But more importantly, I want to talk about, or at least go to the points of the interview where she talks about European security and making sure that states like the UK in particular, and of course Norway, are included in these talks. And he's talking about an upcoming white paper that they are going to produce about this very thing, because this is important. This is very, very important when we talk about sort of European sort of security on this issue, and having strategic autonomy is becoming, I think, more and more very clear we need it. So before we do go over on into this, please do remember to click on the like, the share button, and of course down below, if you'd like to help support the channel, there's the Patreon page, there's the Buy Me Coffee link where you can all buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there is the Pony Club down below as well. So let's crack on then into this. This comes from, believe it or not, Social Europe on this, and it's the if you want to read the full, this is a very good interview, by the way. Definitely recommend sort of reading more of it, because they go into talking about the internal divisions, of course, in the EU, how they could sort of look at sort of helping these things, uh, ways that countries sort of could cooperate together, even though there might not be the full consensus in the EU. But it leaves the door open whether if they want to, things like that. They talk about, of course, the threat provided shown by sort of Elon Musk as well. So it is a very, very good interview. Definitely worth a read. Go check it out yourself. However, I do want to sort of highlight just the beginning of this because I think it again sets the stage for this, and then I want to jump forward towards the bottom to talking about sort of working together and more closer European cooperation, as you'll see in a moment, especially with the UK. So, so let's go on into this. So, Henning Mera is the guy who is sort of conducting this interview. And he goes, Alma, thank you very much for joining me to discuss these very critical issues of European foreign and security policy. At a time now of profound change, we move into 2025. Let us get started. The concept now of strategic autonomy has been prominently discussed within the European Union. How do you assess, of course, its relevance in today's environment, and what does achieving it actually entail? So, Albert responds to that question, saying, thank you for having. Thank you. It's great to join me this conversation and dive into these very critical topics. Strategic autonomy is a concept that can sometimes feel abstract, almost like something developed in a laboratory. However, it is deeply rooted in real world challenges. Over the years, the hopes, of course, of the global setup naturally do reflect the interests of course, the EU and its member states, has been contrasted for quite some time. The world today, of course, in 2025, poses some serious and existential threats to Europe. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is the most pressing example. It exposes Europe's vulnerabilities and the necessary for now greater strategic autonomy. On top of this, the unpredictability of the United States under President Trump's second administration raises the stakes. While there is a consensus that Europe needs to take more responsibility for their own security, the situation is complicated by Trump's erratic leadership, and with forces in Europe now content to ally with with who will at times now be openly now malign and unpredictable and even fast moving. For the first time since the early 1990s, the EU now must grapple with the urgent task of creating strategic autonomy in these unprecedented challenges. This isn't just about military matters, it spans economic security, technological resilience, and the ability now to act decisively in an unstable world. Achieving this will be difficult as the EU faces now a global environment that is now less and less favorable to its founding principles and goals. And I think she gets that 100% right. This is a massive challenge, a massive challenge that not just the EU has to face, but all of Europe too. And I think the fact that, as she gets right, this has become an increasing topic. The erraticness of Trump's leadership, what he may do, how quickly and fast he may react. The EU cannot afford to be slow in reacting to some of these things. It must act fast if something, you know, uh, you know, quick happens or Trump makes a, snap decision. She's right as well. That is also more than just military matters. This is about, economic security. Again, tariffs can have a big impact on that. Not only supply chains as well. Those must be, protected as well. Technological resilience, we've seen in Ukraine, Elon Musk basically turning off Ukraine's ability to be able to defend itself. So that is something that Europe needs to make sure that it has on its side as well. And of course, as you finally pointed out, the ability to act decisively, not sit and do nothing while, countries debilitate that, or at least, you know, more about it. There must be fast reaction with that. So, with that, that sets the stage of what the rest of this conversation is going to be like. And now I'm going to jump down to where they talk about strategic defense and where sort of this is really important. So, Henning Miller continues with this. So you mentioned, of course, a white paper on defense that is now in the works. If you were drafting it, what would you prioritize? And what Mueller says, the white paper must tackle both the immediate and long-term challenges. First, Europe needs a sustainable mechanism for financing defense. The Next Generation EU fund was transformative during the COVID pandemic, and we need now a similar approach for security and defense. Joint borrowing could provide the necessary resources, though it does remain politically sensitive. Again, that would be something great that has been talked about. Replicating the EU sort of pandemic response rather than individual countries buy their own sort of equipment. The EU is going to sort of buy big in bulk with the borrowing power of all the EU members combined together. Again, imagine if you could do that with all that combined with defense. All of a sudden, you could very easily turn Europe into quite a defense spending powerhouse. That would be a lot of money available suddenly to not only borrow but spend on defense. This would be important for increasing material. We've seen problems with producing, artillery shell en masse for Ukraine. We've even seen countries reopen, defunct artillery factories or even building new artillery factories because, well, they saw the shell consumption that was going on there in Ukraine, and they realized very quickly, well, we don't have the capacity to keep on pumping out those shells. So we need more factories to be able to do that. And that's not just, the assembly of the shell as well. It's like the explosives. There was a big thing about a shortage of the explosive itself to put into those artillery shells that was a big cap in the supply line. So it is more about just than the production of the artillery shell as well. It's the explosive element that goes into the shell as well. So there is a lot of stuff that really, really sort of needs to be looked at when you are looking at these supply chains, when you are looking at that manufacturing and how it goes to creating that as well. So that is something that will need to be addressed. And they also do point out how it does very much remain a very political sensitive topic, especially that idea of joint borrowing. Because remember, as I've said, always was a difference between British Euroscepticism and European Euroscepticism. British Euroscepticism was always about free market fundamentalism. We don't want governments involved in regulation, hence why the push was to leave. European Euroscepticism is more about integration, like that closer ever integration. They don't mind things like the single market. They don't mind the regulations, but it's that ever closer, joining of the unions of the union. That is what they are skeptical of, and that is what the difference always has been between European and British Euroscepticism. So I want to go on talk about sort of the next thing that she says. She continues. Collaboration with non-EU partners like the UK and Norway is also essential. The UK in particular brings very significant weight to European defence, and finding ways now to integrate it into European frameworks will be critical. But since Brexit, this has become now politically difficult. The white paper should show a path towards re-energizing cooperation. Finally, the white paper should also address political mechanisms that require it now to act decisively. European decision-making process needs to adapt at a pace of now to modern crises. Coalitions of the willing can help, but it is no substitute for a more agile now and unified approach. So, two things there easily there to point out. All of Europe must be involved in this, not just the UK, but Norway as well. And I think you see people forgetting that. you know, um, you know, Norway isn't part of the EU, but it is part of Europe. Its defense matters just as much. And we do bring, as it rightly points out, we do bring a lot of very significant weight to European defense. When we did not that too long ago, where I talked about creating the North Sea as a big area for like, European green energy powering. Um, a lot of the area that you would need to create that is in British coastal waters because of, again, the unique geography um, of the UK and things like that. Basically, mean that even if there was a lull in the wind turbines in the North Sea still generate. They don't if they're off the coast of Europe. And that is because of the unique geographical position of the UK. That is why I said, there has to be an area of cooperation in that. That could be an amazing project. But to do it, you would need the UK to cooperate on it. Again, we can bring stuff. Again, when you talk about defense to the rest of Europe, we are one of the few countries that has their own nuclear weapons. It's pretty much us and France. If Donald Trump decides to withdraw US nuclear weapons from Europe, all of a sudden it's only us and France that has nuclear weapons. We've talked before about extending the nuclear umbrella of our, armaments to the rest of Europe. That is something that has to be and should be talked about more in that case. So that is something that is very true. And again, yeah, Brexit, it has become sort of very politically difficult. Keir Starmer right now has to be very, very careful of igniting a Brexit betrayal argument. Because if you think that, Rupert Murdoch, who owns like 40% of the British press, isn't suddenly going to start churning out anti-European propaganda or anything like that again, think again on that. So, anyway, it continues. Henning Miller says, you mentioned, of course, the political ownership and the challenge now of conflict now as the new normal. How well prepared is the EU now for this new reality? The EU has, of course, been operating now with its own framework designed for less conflictual times. As a result, its structures now are not well suited to rapid pace and high stakes decision making required for today. Reaching a consensus among its 27 states does take time, a luxury now that we no longer have. Very true. This has been talked about before about changing the nature of the EU. So it doesn't have to rely on one country saying, no, we're not going to do that. And then it scuppers the entire idea. Recent developments, they continue with, it do include high-level meetings on security and defense, such as in Helsinki this week, that reports by the likes of Marco Draghi, Ettore Lirti, and Sviano Nisilto show that the urgency now is very much understood. However, the pace of EU decision-making must now change fundamentally. Traditional consensus-driven machinery has now reached its limits. While the ideal remains of achieving consensus among all member states, the environment now demands a different mode of operation. So that is all about making sure that in some of these areas that there is the ability to not wait on all, 27 member states, so that maybe, Viktor Orban might go, nah, I don't really like doing that. So it is very, very much sort of recognized that the EU sort of has to change on that. And I will say that as well. The EU does have to change on that for a number of reasons. Its decision making process is far, far too slow. It needs to be a lot more reactive. So back to this. Henry Miller says, partnerships, of course, with external allies, particularly the United Kingdom, are pivotal. How, of course, do we envision now deepening these ties? Albert Muller responds, saying it is absolutely vital now for the EU to engage the UK meaningfully in security and defence. Prime Minister Starmer has now more breathing space on this issue than he would now have on broader EU matters. In Britain, European security is now viewed with shared concern with the continent. This presents now an opportunity to build closer ties without reigniting the sensitivities of Brexit. And that's true as well. We've seen that, and they will talk about that in a moment. The British-German treaty that was signed potentially not too long ago, although we'll see if they, depending on what's going to happen soon, how much that goes through, whether it survives or not. But again, it would be foolish for, I think, any future German government to just trash that completely. Um, Anyway, they continue. The challenge now, of course, lies in navigating the political dynamics, of course, on both sides. Crafting partnerships that do involve defense cooperation, joint procurement, and now shared resources, without now appearing to undermine Brexit outcomes. It is a delicate, but it is essential. If the EU and NATO can present a compelling case for these collaborations, aligning corporate and public interests, I am optimistic about its possibilities. Again, I'm optimistic very much as well. We do need um, to have these agreements, to have that defense cooperation, joint procurement, shared resources. It is becoming ever more clear on that, and that is something even our own politicians in the UK cannot ignore. They cannot ignore that ever more. So Henning continues. You mentioned, of course, now corporate interests. Political incentives for corporate cooperation are, of course, very powerful. After the signing, of course, the recent German-British treaty, for instance, we saw Rheinmetall announce new investments in the UK. It is a very clear example of how bilateral agreements can, of course, spur industrial cooperation. Again, very true as well. Scaling this approach to our European level could improve programs that are now design incentives for joint ventures, specifically in the defense industry. Such initiatives would not only strengthen security capabilities, but it would also now deepen economic ties across the continent and with the UK. So, again, something we cannot ignore. Doing those joint incentives, those joint ventures are ever and ever more important. We've seen that with Rheinmetall announcing their investments into the UK. Very, very important. That is good. We need those types of investments, not only here, but for all of Europe as well. And I keep on pointing out, you cannot just, you know, I always get at the right when they talk about China as if you can just ignore like China and just put it away in a box. I've now seen this very, very same visceral reaction from a lot of Europeans who just think, you can just ignore the UK. No, you can't. The UK is not going anywhere. Just as I've said to many Brexiteers on this issue, yeah, the EU is not going anywhere either. You've got to accept that it is there, and we have a government that is now engaging with the EU on that reality that it is there. They ain't going anywhere anytime soon. It's a completely different approach from our last very, very pro-Brexity government that just sort of like to ignore the EU, that it wasn't even there. If you remember back in what is it, 2001, we even had a quote at the time from the government, from Boris Johnson's government, saying, "Yeah, we've got no interest in talking with the EU until 2022." If you remember that far back. Anyway, um, and a final question. You've painted, of course, a picture now of these challenges and opportunities. As we finish our conversation, what is, of course, your vision for the EU in 2025 and beyond? Uh, my vision is, of course, one of the EU that has now risen to this challenge, providing its capability to adapt and lead. The old European security order is now gone. Europe must now claim its place at the table in shaping what comes next. This means now earning its attention and respect of partners abroad by demonstrating resolve and effectiveness at home. I remain optimistic. Europe is, of course, still has political and material resources to succeed. In 2025, now presents a very critical window of opportunity. As think tanks, policymakers, and citizens, we must now focus on identifying these options and pushing the political possible. It is time for action, not defeatism. So, yeah, I do see a lot of good stuff in that. And this is coming again from a European, a pan-European, shall we say, think tank uh, that is very sort of influential. Basically saying that, look, if when it comes to sort of strategic economy, this is something that Europe has to take seriously. We've talked about, Typhoon Trump. This will, I think, immediately blow us very, very much back into Port Europe. Um, we'll see how these talks go. I don't think there's an opportunity. Too much might change, but as I've said before, we now have a new guy in charge of this. Starmer's announced his pick, and guess what? He's very, very pro Remain. Um, you know, we'll see. He understands Europe. He's very sort of good with sort of financial stuff. He used to work at I believe HSBC, I believe he was used to work at. So we'll see what happens there. But you've now got an opportunity, and I think it's a very, very clear opportunity to represent itself here for this year. Um, Especially when it comes to defense as well, it is even more important that all of Europe does come together on this. Um, I think the opportunities pointed out here in that interview were very, 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 very good. That for both sort of not only for all of Europe as well, but for the UK. Um, and they are right. Starmer does have a lot larger degree on that when it comes to that. You used to remember, of course, the whole argument about, oh well, if Europe has its own, eternal security, what's the point of NATO? Well, uh, reverse that now. What is the point of European having its the more importance of European having its own strategic autonomy if NATO and the fundamental question of NATO and its reliance, its stability, and its structure are completely broken and shattered by Donald Trump? It makes it makes having Europe's strategic importance ever more important, and it's again yet another defeated argument from the 2016 era by the Brexiteers. So, as of course, as always, let me know what you think down below. But as always, hit the like, hit the share button on your way out, and of course, we'll see you all next time.